In almost every world history class in the Western world, students are taught about the Greco-Persian War, a small, almost forgettable conflict that happened nearly 2,500 years ago between the Greeks and the Persian Empire. To be completely honest, it can hardly be called a war by today's standards, since there were only a handful of major battles, and yet it is still remembered today. What was this ancient war, and why do we still learn about it thousands of years later? Before we can discuss the Greco-Persian War, we must first talk about ancient Greece. In most textbooks, the war is represented with a map that looks more or less like this. But this is very inaccurate. The notion that ancient Greece was at all united during this war is completely false. Greece at this time was made up of over 700 fully independent city-states, all with their own traditions and culture. The two most powerful of these states were Athens and Sparta. First, let's look at Athens, which, as of the start of this war, had recently become one of the first democracies in human history. Athens was famous for its individualism and creativity, and the city was a huge capital of philosophy and education. Sparta, on the other hand, was a very rigid, militaristic society. Young children were drafted into service and spent their entire lives living in military barracks. The ideals of preserving the state and sacrificing oneself for the good of the city were hammered into every citizen from birth. The major differences between these two states shows how unlikely any alliance between the Greek cities was. But as the Persian Empire prepared its assault on the Greek states, a conference was held in Corinth. In 480 BC, representatives from 70 cities met to discuss their common enemy. The representatives had a hard time agreeing on anything, seeing as some of them were at war with each other, and by the time the conference was over, less than 30 representatives remained. This unlikely partnership between the Greek cities would not last long, as we'll discuss later. But now, let's look at the war itself. As the Persian assault began, the Greeks dispatched a small force to Thermopylae, a narrow pass between mountains and the ocean below. Despite their scarce numbers, the Greeks were well equipped, and the geography of the area meant that it was harder for the Persians to advance. However, by using a narrow trail through the mountains, the Persians were able to sneak past enemy lines overnight, catching the Greeks off guard and trapped. The remaining Greek forces fought valiantly, but ultimately the Persians won the day. The second major battle, and the one that would ultimately decide the victory for the Greek alliance, was the Battle of Salamis. After their victory at Thermopylae, the Persians advanced towards Athens with the intention of burning the city and capturing the Athenian navy. However, when they finally reached Athens, they found it abandoned and empty. The Athenian navy had evacuated the remaining population to the nearby island of Salamis. The Persians followed in their own ships, but the narrow geography of the area made it difficult for the massive Persian vessels to maneuver, and the Greeks ended up sinking 200 of their ships. The Battle of Salamis did not end the war, but it certainly turned the tide. Over the next several years, more Greek victories discouraged the Persians from any further invasions. Now we can finally answer the question, why was this war important? Because not only did it not end conflict with the Persian Empire, but it also led indirectly to further conflict within the Greek states. However, one of the most important effects of this war, that still has influence today, is the idea of the Western culture, which some people think may have originated during this war or in the years that followed. While it did not unify the Greek city-states, this war began the long process of creating a unified Greek identity, which later evolved into the Western identity that is still very influential today. People like Socrates, Plato, and their students were born during this period of transition and helped to shape modern culture, philosophy, and government. That is why this ancient conflict is so important to study today and why it is still remembered thousands of years later.